Hello everyone, welcome to our second video on Introduction to the Caribbean. Today we're going to talk about political geography. I'm taking most of this material from an excellent book by Trinidadian historian Franklin Knight. This is called The Caribbean Genesis of a Fragmented Nationalism, and I highly recommend the book to you. Let's jump in and get started. So, which aspect of the Caribbean is the dominant influence on the pattern of life and society, asks Franklin Knight in his introduction. And his answer is that the physical geography is one of the dominant influences on the pattern of life and society on the islands. An island produces a powerful influence on people. Thousands of islands stretch like a backbone from the southern tip of Florida to the northern coastline of South America. These islands form an irregular outer gate to the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. These islands are also totally within the tropics, with the exception of the northern part of the Bahama Islands. So here we see our map. I'm sitting right now in Miami, Florida. These northern islands of the Bahamas are outside the tropics. And so you see here the Greater Antilles, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and then the Lesser Antilles stretching down from the Virgin Islands down to Grenada. And then over here is the ABC Islands and Trinidad and Tobago. This is the Caribbean. And also many people include the coastline well, here are the Guyanas. I almost forgot them. They're actually geographically outside the Caribbean, but socially and culturally, they're very much Caribbean-like in their structure. And then along the coast of Venezuela and Colombia, Panama, and up along the coast of Central America and the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, that completes the Caribbean. So, the outline for our presentation today is settlement, agriculture, physical hazards, indigenous populations, political units, matrilineal inheritance, and a quick comparison of the Carib, Taino, and Siboneyes, and a conclusion. So here's a picture of the Greater Antilles, as I've already mentioned, and the Lesser Antilles. The Lesser Antilles also divide into the Leeward Islands up near the top and the Windward Islands near the bottom. And Aruba, Curacao, Bonaire I don't see on here, Trinidad and Tobago. The Greater and Lesser Antilles, I've already mentioned this, so I'm kind of going back over it. The larger islands, Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, the DR, and Puerto Rico, are the Greater Antilles. The Lesser Antilles are the double chain of islands between Puerto Rico and Trinidad. He's referring to this. And he calls it a double chain of islands because there are some islands like Antigua and Barbuda and Barbados that lie a couple hundred miles to the east. So they're the second part of the chain. The more northerly of the Lesser Antilles is called the Leeward Islands, and the more southern and easterly islands, more towards the wind, are called the Windward. And of course, I've mentioned the ABC Islands include Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. Here they are just off the coast of Venezuela. I haven't been there. If you've been there, let me know. One of these days. The settlement, the Caribbean islands all lie in a healthy environment conducive to the growth of population and complex societies. The photo that I used here, the picture, is an artist's rendering of the Stone Age peoples that lived in the islands. The only remnants of them when the Spanish arrived were a group called the Siboney that lived on the far western part of Cuba. and they were not a complex society. Quite the opposite. They were a very simple society. They were nowhere near the technical development of the Taino Arawaks in terms of farming, hunting, fishing. They lived in caves. They were basically a remnant from the Stone Age peoples. The first permanent settlers came from the tropical forest peoples of South and Central America. So the best guess of archaeologists is that the Caribbean islands were populated as people from Venezuela, basically from the mouth of the Orinoco River area. These tropical forest peoples, as they went exploring and left the mainland and traveled by canoe to Grenada and then up through the islands and gradually populated the islands. These were the first permanent settlers. It's also possible that people could have come from the Yucatan Peninsula to Cuba. It's not that far. It's possible that people may have come from the southern Florida down to Cuba, but there's no archaeological evidence. And what DNA evidence, linguistic evidence, and archaeological evidence that has been found indicate that most of the population of the Caribbean migrated northward from South American mainland. Another group were the Tainos, the Taino-Arawak. Arawak is a larger term for a larger group, linguistic group of peoples. The specific peoples that lived in the Caribbean where Columbus arrived were called Tainos, but they were related to the Arawakan family, and they were fairly sophisticated farmers. The soils were easily cultivated. In some areas, there had been continuous cultivation for centuries. Rainfall is constant from May to November. Temperatures are at sea level between 70 and 90 year-round. Sounds ideal. Here in Miami, it gets down to the 60s and it gets up to the mid-90s. Living in the Caribbean can be easy and natural. I agree. Physical hazards. The greatest physical hazard was from hurricanes. Frequent destructive hurricanes going back as far as we have records. Those of us that live in South Florida were familiar with this pattern of hurricane season. There were also diseases and earthquakes and volcanoes in the Caribbean islands from time to time, but not on the scale of hurricanes on an annual basis. There were also floods, especially from hurricanes. Mosquitoes could carry airborne diseases, but the greatest threat each year are the destructive hurricanes. If you're from South Florida, these pictures might cause a little anxiety. The indigenous population, the website I got this picture from mentioned Caribs, but it kind of works. I mean, it's kind of indescript, so I put it here. The indigenous population, Christopher Columbus and Bartolome de las Casas both kept journals at the time, eyewitness accounts, and they both exaggerated the size of the indigenous populations. Bartolome de las Casas probably for activist reasons, trying to emphasize his points about the damaging effects of the presence of the Spanish on the indigenous population. A reasonable estimate may be no more than 750,000 people were living on Hispaniola at the time. Cuba had about 50,000 people living on it. Hispaniola, due to its size and central location, might have had the most densely settled population in 1492 of perhaps 500,000 people. I believe Jamaica had about 20,000 people, the estimates are. And here you see the distribution of ethnicity. This whole central area were Tainos, which were part of the Arawak family. And it describes them here in Spanish: Tainos Occidentales, Tainos Clásicos, y Tainos Orientales. That is, Western Tainos, Classic Tainos, and Eastern Tainos. That's because there were subtle differences in language, subtle differences in culture and social structure, but not significant differences. Basically, they were the same people. And as you saw in the slide before, by far the largest concentration of Tainos were in Hispaniola, which is the island that presently composes the two countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Far over here on the west are the Guanahatabes. Guanahatabeyes. I don't know how to pronounce that. Guanahatabeyes. That's my best. I like Siboney much easier. Siboney I've seen spelled with a C or an S. But these were a very distinct group of people, culturally vastly different from the Tainos, much less complexity in their social structure, primitive tools, stone tools, primitive weapons, living in caves, and they were often enslaved by Tainos, according to some of the eyewitness accounts. Down here in the green at the far southeast are the Caribs or Caribs of the Islas. These were people who were very warlike. They may have been distantly related to the Taino Arawaks. They departed from the coast of the South American coast by canoe, and they traveled in war canoes that would hold up to 60 warriors. And they were traveling from island to island, moving up through the Lesser Antilles, conquering each island as they went. They had a reputation among the Spanish as being cannibals. That has been disputed by some archaeologists, so we're not entirely certain if it was ritual cannibalism or if that was just a bad rap that they got. They were fiercely warlike. One of the differences with the Tainos is the Tainos had ball courts, and they played a type of hybrid soccer basketball where they would two teams would play, and the winners would be the ones that could get the ball through a hoop, but they had to do it with their feet or their hips. They couldn't use their hands, and they had religious significance. Well, Tainos played this with rubber balls that were imported from the Yucatan Peninsula, but the Caribs did not play that game. There's no archaeological evidence that they ever indulged in that game. They indulged in warfare, and they were quite good at it, and had developed it to I guess, a cruel art form. So they were moving up, and they arrived. They started arriving up to the central part of the Lesser Antilles about the same time as the Spanish arrived in Hispaniola. Otherwise, they may have gotten further. So, interestingly enough, the Caribs are the only ones that have survived through modern day. The Siboney or the Guanajuato are I already mentioned, are the least complex, the most simple cultural forms, the least developed, lived in caves on the western end of the island of Cuba. They probably were a remnant left over from older Stone Age peoples that lived in the Caribbean. Maybe they might have come from, I'm speculating here, but perhaps they had come from the Yucatan Peninsula or some other direction, but they were not related genetically or archaeologically or culturally to the Taino Arawak. The Taino Arawak was the largest indigenous group. They were part of the larger Arawak culture that extended down into Venezuela, and they were the dominant group living in Hispaniola. So they were the ones that the Spanish initially interacted with. And they were perhaps the most peaceful ethnic group in the Americas, according to the accounts. They were excellent farmers. One thing that the Taino Arawak had learned was how to process yucca, because if the yucca plant is eaten without the proper processing, it's poisonous. And the Taino Arawak had developed a technology for squeezing the poison out of the yucca root and turning yucca into bread. And of course, if you are Cuban and you love yucca or maduros, I'm sorry, I'm mixing them up. Maduros are not the same thing as yucca, but if you like fried or boiled yuca, you have to thank the Taino Arawaks. And I've already talked about the Caribs. The Siboney were the most westerly in the Caribbean and the oldest cultural group in the region, and very little was really known about them. They were scattered throughout Cuba, and they sometimes were enslaved by the Taino. The excavations of Siboney sites revealed no pottery or utensils or weapons, no evidence of any organized ritualistic religion or complex social organization. They were hunter-gatherers living in nomadic bands. Both Christopher Columbus and Bartolomé de las Casas left extensive eyewitness journals of their contact with the indigenous peoples. So a lot of what we know about the Arawakan or Taino society comes from their writings. The Taino society was composed of theocratic chieftains. They were related to other groups on the mainland of South America, what we call today Colombia and Venezuela. The Chibcha are Colombian, Warao, Yanomamo, which are in Venezuela, Caracas, Palenque, Cacatillo of the Jirajara of the Colombian Venezuelan tropical forest belt. They did have a highly organized religious belief worldview based on a hierarchy of gods and men. Public ball courts were found in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola. The Tainos seem to have been the least aggressive people of the Americas. And here's several pictures that I found that I wanted to share. These are pictures of fishing. Here there's one of their settlements. Matrilineal inheritance. Among the Taino, the inheritance was passed down through the maternal line. Polygamy was a social custom among the Taino. The heirs of the chiefs who were incompetent were rejected by the people in favor of a locally elected member of the common people. So it was a flexible society with some degree of what we would call today democracy. The Caribs, I've already spoken about a bit. They were fierce and proud. Not much is actually known about them. They actually survived better the arrival of Europeans than the Tainos. There's a lot of reasons for that. One was they tended to live in areas where the Spanish were not interested in colonizing. So they had almost an additional 100 years after the Tainos were pretty much destroyed before English and French and Dutch started arriving in the Lesser Antilles and the Windward Islands and setting up settlements. And so the Caribs were better prepared to resist Europeans by the time the other Europeans arrived. War seemed to be a central organizing principle for the Caribs. Many of their females have been taken captive from the Tainos, so much so that two gender-based dialects evolved. The female Caribs spoke a dialect that was similar to a Taino dialect, whereas the male Caribs spoke a different dialect, which might indicate that they primarily got their women by kidnapping them from Tainos. An interesting approach. Interestingly, also, the Tainos are pretty much Tainos survive in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic genetically. So Puerto Ricans and the Dominicans have some genetic percentage of Taino genomes, but the Caribs have actually physically endured, and there's small colonies of Caribs that still live in primarily in the island of Dominica, and I've also heard in St. Vincent. There are groups of modern Carib tribes, and they also intermarried or intermingled with black African slaves. And out of the combination of Caribs and Africans emerged a new ethnic group called the Garifuna. I actually read that the Caribs would paddle out to Dutch or British or Portuguese ships that were slave traders that had slaves on board, and they would fight and take over the ship and set free the slaves just to be a headache to the Europeans. And so They freed a number of African slaves from the Europeans, who then joined the Carib tribe, intermarried, and had children. And then a new group with a mingled language emerged called the Garifuna, who were finally forcibly removed from their island by the British and set adrift in the Caribbean. They wound up in Honduras, and the Garifuna people have multiplied along the coasts of Central America, from Nicaragua up to Honduras. The eastern coasts of those countries are largely Garifuna people, who are descended from Nigerians, Red, and Caribbeans or Caribs. Very interesting story. Comparison of the Caribe, Taino, and Siboneyes. The difference between the three groups are only one of degree rather than kind. There was a certain fluidity as the three groups merged into one local group. The Siboney had almost been absorbed by the Tainos, which had a more complex and advanced culture. The Tainos have been partially expelled and partially incorporated by the Caribs in the southern part of the Lesser Antilles. All the indigenous Caribbean peoples were already undergoing critical internal change when the Spanish arrived to establish permanent colonies at the end of the 15th century. The Caribs gave up their cannibalism and became farmers. I also wanted to mention here at the end that there was a population collapse of the Tainos from the 750,000 that the author Franklin Knight estimates of Tainos when the Spanish arrived. Within 50 years, they had collapsed to the point that there were no more than 50,000 left, scattered around several islands. This is not just, this is through overwork, through butchery and abuse by the Spanish, but also diseases. And so the entire Taino population just completely collapsed under the weight of Spanish exploitation. So that ends our discussion of our second discussion of the Caribbean. Pretty soon we'll start getting into early Caribbean European history and the history of the slave trade and the development of sugar plantations. So bear with me as we go forward. Thank you. Talk to you again soon, hopefully next week. Take care.